episode. It was pretty much the introduction to this little program we're trying to put together, and it is about showing the plan that God has in the Bible for all humanity, from the original intended way of understanding it. And of course, we are focusing and highlighting mostly the Noahide laws. We've been watching and noticing that there are people who are beginning to see about, listen to and see these laws being spoken about and hearing. And so, some are doing injustice to them by the fact that they're speaking about them and not really knowing about them. And instead of actually seeking to know more about what they are and how they're supposed to be understood. Because in reality, regardless of religious mindset, these are laws that any one person can adapt into their lifestyle. And in just beginning that journey will transcend their knowledge to a different level when it comes to being a better human being. Regardless of where they reach on the levels of, whether they want to accept that God exists or doesn't exist, or, who God is for them or not, that eventually is something that they have to work out for themselves. The main point we're trying to show is, God does have a plan, and He didn't create haphazardly. He thought things through, if we may use, anthropomorphism as we speak. Y'all remember Jack? And welcome again.
Well, and two, we had noticed a lot of different takes on the Noahide laws, and sometimes you find, like on YouTube recently, we were looking at where somebody had done several little bits on the fact that these laws don't even exist. Mm-hmm. And so in some sense we're trying to put forth a defense of that. The last time that we got together, we talked about the fact that there was 2,448 years that actually transpires before we actually get the written text of the Torah. And so some people say, well, gee, we can't find these 7 listed as a list, as you find the 10 words, or commonly referred to by people as 10 commandments. But we're saying that man had always had this covenant relationship with God from the very beginning. And because he has a covenant relationship with God, then there's an expectation from God to man to live a certain lifestyle. So we wouldn't have left him without laws. We proved that. From the very creation of man had already given him laws. I mean, even what we find in the written text in Genesis, the book of Bereshit, that the thought of man being brought into the world, all of a sudden he has a dietary law. He's to eat, not to eat meat, by the way. He can only eat the seed-bearing green herbs, and he can only eat the fruit of the trees that has the seed within it. So there's a dietary restriction from the very beginning. Later on, when man is actually, the second part of the story, man is actually created. God tells us that he creates man. And he winds up putting him in the garden, and he gets similarly another prohibition: don't eat of that tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So in some sense, man's always had this kind of covenant relationship with the Creator. Whether it was humanity at large, or whether it was a smaller group of humanity that we know as Israel, which also has this covenant relationship with God. But what we would like to do is take up a text that's not so well known and not spoken of, because somebody would say, well, gee, if these laws were there, then why doesn't somebody later on bring them up? And so what we would like to do is take like I said, it's a text that's not so well known. It's in Isaiah. It's Isaiah chapter 24 and verse 5. And there's a lot of speculation, not say a lot of speculation, but there's some speculation that this text actually is related to the covenant relationship that existed between Israel and the people of Israel and God. But the majority of the commentators, they say this text actually refers to the Noahidic covenant, which would involve all those laws up until that point in time. And men like Maudlin, for example, Arbanel, and many other commentators. And by the way, I even found there was a lot of Christian commentators. Can't remember them right off the top of my head, but there were quite a few Christian commentators that actually says that this verse actually belongs to the covenant that existed from Adam up until Noah, and even from Noah on. But that's a little bit different story, because a lot of those people are what we call covenanters, and they see a covenant that existed with Adam, and then later on was reinforced with Noah, and eventually reinforced with the people of Israel. But what we would like to do is take this passage in Isaiah 24:5. We want to read it to you, and then we want to analyze what he says. So Hiram's going to do this honors of reading Isaiah chapter 24, verse 5 for us.
The earth also defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore hath the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate.
That's good enough. The point of this text, by the way, the reason it seems to be more universal is because the earth, the inhabitants of the earth, it's not just the inhabitants of the land of Israel, but the inhabitants of the earth, Eretz, which could be earth, it could be just Israel itself, but the inhabitants, right? It's not one specific group of inhabitants. If we said, for example, that the Israelites had defiled the earth, okay, then we'd think this has more relationship to the covenant that existed between God and the people of Israel. But the inhabitants of the earth does this. But what we do see from Isaiah says that there's a threefold problem here, right? He says, again, if you read those three things that he says, that's okay, I got it marked there. And he gives three reasons.
The earth also is defiled,
right,
under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws,
right,
changed the ordinance,
right,
broken the everlasting covenant.
Okay, so
Written.
Right, the brittle one. And when he says, by the way, that they have transgressed the law, it's not the Torah here, it's Torot, which generally we understand as teaching. If he had said Torah, then we would have been specifically talking about the first 5 books that contains the laws, ordinance, statutes, and so forth for the people of Israel. But in this sense, he's saying Torah, the teachings, right? So, that 2,448 years that we spoke about, pretty lengthy about, seems to be silent, but he isn't, because here he's telling us they violated the teachings. So what type of teachings did they violate? I mean, that's the real question, right? So what we would like to do at this time is do kind of a comparative analysis with what Isaiah is saying that occurred prior to the flood, and what actually transpired in the flood, pre-flood civilization. And so the first one he says that they just basically messed up the teachings, right? Well, what was the first teachings, right? So we want to talk about corruption on 3 different levels, because when we go back to the Genesis text and we start looking at the story there, God tells us at least 3 times the earth has corrupted itself, right?
Right. And it says the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence.
Right. So we have that idea.
And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt.
Right.
For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth.
Right.
And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence.
Exactly.